In this demonstration, we're going to show how to configure Google Apps to use a single sign-on system for authentication of the users. This demonstration, we will illustrate the following. We're going to configure the Google Apps control panel to use a single sign-on system for authentication. We will then, once that's configured, we will illustrate the special behavior for the domain administrator and how they have access to Google Apps. Then we will illustrate how a single sign-on system behaves when it is behind the firewall. So we will show how a VPN solution can be used. And finally, we will illustrate how the password is being used for the different scenarios. Before we begin the demonstration, let's review the architecture we're going to be using in the training environment. The architecture today has the single sign-on system behind the firewall, and the single sign-on system will contact the user data store to verify the username and password, which has been pre-configured already. The user, to access the single sign-on system, will first need to establish a VPN tunnel through the firewall to the single sign-on system. Without that connectivity of the VPN tunnel, the user will try to access Google Apps, but they will not be able to access the single sign-on system. Thus, the user will not be authenticated and not have access to Google Apps. Throughout this demonstration, please keep in mind of this architecture solution that we will be using. I'm going to first log in to the control panel. Notice my URL, google.com/a/my-domain. We're going to log into my control panel, and we're going to configure the single sign-on setting. I'm going to log in as my administrator account, and this administrator has full privileges. I've logged in, and now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set the Advanced Tools settings. So Advanced Tools. Now, here under the section called Authentication, we will go ahead and set up the single sign-on settings. As a reminder, two-step verification is not compatible when you set up single sign-on. Now we're here on the configuration screen of the actual single sign-on. The first thing I always recommend is to upload the certificate. So we'll click on Choose File, and I'll go ahead and find my certificate that I have, and I point that and I upload it. Now it's always recommended to first always upload the certificate. Now if you've uploaded an incorrect certificate, just click on Replace Certificate and you'll get the prompt again. So please upload the certificate first, because if you put in the URLs first and then upload the certificates, oftentimes the URLs get lost and you have to re-add them. So I've uploaded the certificate. Now I'll go ahead and add the URLs. So here's my login. Now the login URL is what the user will be redirected to when they go to log into Google Apps. And now I will enter my sign out page URL. This is the URL when the user logs out of Google Apps. This is where we want the user to be redirected to. And the last element will be the change password URL. So in Google Apps, users can go, and we can see that here on the top right, they can go to the account settings. If this does not have the information that I've just entered, we will go to the normal Google Apps settings. But because we've implemented a single sign-on system in this example, we don't want the user to go to the Google Apps password reset. We want them to actually go to a specific place in our single sign-on system to invoke a change password functionality. Now that I've entered the URLs, the next piece I need to do is enable the single sign-on feature. And completing that checkbox, I'll now click on Save Changes. So what have we done? Let's just recap. We've added the URL for the sign-in page. That's a redirection. We've added a sign-out page when the user logs out. And finally, there's the change password link. So when the user does select change password within Google Apps, they're going to be redirected to this URL. Remember also, we've added the certificate. That will allow when the signed SAML request comes back from the identity provider, that signed request will be with the private key. Google Apps can then decode that and verify that it came from the correct identity provider, A, and B, that the message has not been tampered. to remind everybody of our training environment. Remember, the single sign-on system is behind a firewall. So if we do not have our VPN tunnel connected, when we go to get redirected, we will not be able to have access. So I'm going to illustrate two things. One, that the VPN is not connected and we're going to see some error messages. Two, we will connect our VPN and then we'll be able to connect to our single sign-on system. I'm going to first illustrate that we do not have connectivity to the single sign-on system. I have entered the URL above, which is the URL for the single sign-on system's redirection. Now, depending on your single sign-on system, that redirection may or may not give you the results you're looking for, but definitely it will be very similar in this fact that I cannot find the page, could not find the server with that port. I want to show once again that we don't have access to the single sign-on server. So when I try to log into Google Apps, the redirection should fail for the regular user, non-admin user. And that is true. When I typed in mail.google.com/a/domain, it says it cannot find the server. And that is consistent. Next, I'm going to connect to the single sign-on system through the VPN tunnel. So I'm going to go ahead and activate that. And now we see green at the top, so that means my connectivity is working. I'm going to run a quick test with the same login URL that we saw earlier. And you'll notice we are prompted. So that confirms that we do have access through the VPN tunnel to the single sign-on system. So next what I'm going to do is log in to Google Apps Mail for my domain. And we're being prompted for my username and password. And I'm going to type in the user and its password and log in. We can see here that mail is coming up for that user. This user does exist in Google Apps. There's a user called user1. This user, also user1, exists in the store, the identity provider store for the username and password as well. In this example, we were authenticating the password against the store that the single sign-on system is using. We were not using the password stored in Google Apps. I want to show next what happens when a user changes their password. Key things to remember is notice the correct redirection. We will not be redirecting to Google Apps, rather we'll be redirecting to the URL that was provided in the configuration of the control panel. Now, we're going to take a look at changing this user's password. So on the right-hand side, we see the user's email address. I'll click on that, and we'll click on the link that says Account. Now that I've clicked on Account, we'll see that there's a link called Change Password. I'll go ahead and click on that. Now this is the key piece. Because we have configured single sign-on for the domain, and we have provided a URL for the change password, we are actually being rerouted to a specific change password page for this SSO system. It is not the normal change password page when you change your Gmail account or a non-SSO enabled domain. I'm not going to change my password today. The key thing I want to illustrate here is that the user gets redirected. In this next demonstration, we're going to take a look at the user who has successfully authenticated into Google Apps, which has meant that they have been connecting to the single sign-on system through their VPN tunnel. And then we're going to disconnect the VPN tunnel but not sign out of Google Apps. Now the correct behavior, they should still have access to Google Apps. Let's see that in action. Now, we're going to run the test. First, you'll notice I have not been connected to my VPN connectivity. I'm a regular user. I'm going to try to access my mail. Notice the redirection has occurred correctly, but unfortunately, because my user cannot access the single sign-on system, which is behind the firewall at this time, we are unable to access Google Apps because we cannot authenticate into this SO system. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to turn on the VPN connectivity. You'll notice the green indicates that I have VPN connectivity. Let's try the access again. And now I've authenticated in. Now because I've authenticated in successfully, we can now do our next test where we are going to disconnect. I'm going to disconnect from the VPN and do a test to see if I still have Google Apps access. Go to my mailbox, I'm going to compose a message. And I've sent that message. We can see that the message has been sent, and we can view the message. Let's go to my documents, and I have access to my documents. So the user's not been signed out. The user has still connecting to Google Apps, even though the VPN connectivity has been disconnected. Now, we're going to take a look at what happens when the administrator logs into Google Apps. Okay, this time I'm going to log in to the control panel directly. And you'll notice that when you log into the control panel directly, it takes you to the standard username and password screen. I do have single sign-on implemented, but the control panel access never uses the single sign-on. And the reason is, if your single sign-on is down, then you will not be able to configure the new information, whether to turn it off or to set it to a different URL pair. So I'll go ahead and log in. And just to confirm, in this scenario where I'm logging into the control panel with that user, I am not using the password stored in the single sign-on mechanism. I'm using the password stored in Google Apps. And from here, I'll go ahead and sign out. We'll log one more time. Now, I've been logged into the VPN. I'm going to disconnect the VPN. And I'm going to log in again as administrator, just to clearly illustrate once again that the single sign-on system is not being used. And once again, it is not being used. We can see that very clearly here. Now, from the bar up here, the menu bar, I can click on Mail, and I can get into my administrator account. So as an administrator, I can log in to Google Apps without the single sign-on system when I go to the control panel. Let us review the objectives that were covered in this module. This demonstration illustrated the following: how to configure Google Apps to use a single sign-on system to authenticate the user. Second, we looked at the special behavior for the domain administrator access. Remember, the domain administrator can log into the control panel, and that user does not need to have access to the single sign-on system. The password in that case will be used the password stored at Google Apps. In this particular example, we looked at a SSO system behind the firewall, which added a few additional complexities. One, when this is the case that the SSO is behind the firewall, the user will need to either be behind the firewall to access the SSO, or if they're outside the firewall, they'll need a VPN connectivity into the system, so when they access Google Apps, the redirection will direct them to the resource behind the firewall. And lastly, we looked at which password is being used. So when a regular user authenticates in, we use the password that the single sign-on system fetches from the data store. And when the administrator logs in through the control panel, we use the password stored at Google Apps.